Hello, my name is Dr. Tom Bennett. I'm from the Kane University in the Battleship Oral History Program. Today is October 7th, the year 2006. We're aboard the battleship in the executive officers compartment. I'm with Captain Charles Costin Coley, who served as the executive officer aboard the Battleship New Jersey from October 20th, 1950 until February 2nd, 1952. During the Korean War, and under two captains, Captain Tyree and Captain McCorkle. Captain Coley, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much.
Let's start off the conversation. You had a long career in the Navy. I see here you were in the Navy from 1930 until 1960. How did you get involved with the Navy?
Well, I had a brother that graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924. And when he'd come home for vacation in September, we call it September leave, I always liked what I saw and how he wore his uniform, and he was about 6 feet tall and I'm 5 feet 6, but he was a very, very likable person, and as all my brothers were. But I just got it. I was about in the 5th grade at that time, and I decided then that I wanted to go to the Naval Academy and be a naval officer, and that's what I did.
What was life like at the Naval Academy during the early 1930s?
Well, it was very, very an abrupt awakening for a young man from Oklahoma City to go to the Naval Academy, and I remember walking into the Commandant of Midshipmen's office, Captain Snyder, I believe it was at the time, and I kind of leaned on his desk and he said, "Stand up, Mr. Coley, you're in the Navy." I jumped like somebody stuck me with a hot poker, and that was just a couple of things, and the rigidness and the discipline and the thoroughness and the education at the Naval Academy. I can't say too much for it. In my opinion, if I hadn't gone to the Naval Academy, I doubt if I'd have amounted to very much. Not that I'd have amounted to a lot, but I'd be a lot worse off than I am.
So once you get out of the Naval Academy, trace in a few minutes your career until you joined the Battleship New Jersey in 1950.
I didn't quite.
Oh, once you graduate the Naval Academy, could you please trace your career briefly from the time you graduate until the time you joined the Battleship New Jersey?
Yes, I can tell you that fairly well. I went to the USS Maryland, which was one of the latest battleships at that time. It was built in 1923, and it also had 16-inch guns, but they couldn't elevate above 45 degrees because of the treaty. And from the USS Maryland, I went to the USS Nitro, which was an ammunition carrier. I put in a request to go to the China station, and so I served on the Nitro for about 6 months. My orders came through to go to China, and I arrived in the Philippines on about the 26th of December 1936. And I reported to the USS Barker, a destroyer, 213. And I served on the Barker as torpedo officer and communication officer until April of 1938. And then I was ordered up the Yangtze Patrol, Yangtze River, to a USS Guam. It was a river gunboat. It drew about 6 feet of water, had 3 rudders and 2 screws, and it was built in China. It was a white one, very, very comfortable ship. Had a crew of about 54 men and 4 officers, and I served up there. While the river was barricaded, the Sino-Japanese War was going on at that time, and the river was barricaded between Shanghai and Hankow. But in about close to Christmas of 1938, the Japanese broke the barricade, and they came up and they led us down the river. And I arrived in Shanghai about the 22nd of December 1938. I stayed there until about May of 1939, and then I returned to the United States. The tour duty in Shanghai and China Station was 2.5 years.
If I can jump in at this point, what do you recall about your experiences in China? What do you recall about your experiences in China? You've heard of the rape of Nanking, the attack on an American gunboat, as like precursors to World War II. Can you take us back and just draw a picture of China at the time and your feelings, your reactions that you had to the situation and to the Japanese?
Well, it was a period in China, particularly up the Yangtze River, that life will never be like it again. The exchange was $3.30 for $1 US, and you could go ashore and you could ride rickshaws, or you could live like a king almost on an ensign's pay, which was about $125 a month. And I remember going into Shanghai in 1938, and we would pass a Japanese man of war, and the Japanese would be firing at the Chinese over on the beach. Now, when two men of war from different countries pass one another, they sound attention and salute each other as they pass. And then after you pass, they sound carry on, and so the Japanese would stop firing and they'd sound salute. And after we passed, they'd sound carry on. They'd turn around and start shooting at the the Chinese again, which was very, very unique. And I noticed the Japanese getting a little bit more arrogant, a little bit more rigid, and restricting us in our movements in Shanghai as time went on. I didn't ever visualize that they would have December the 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, but if we'd studied the history of the Japanese fleets, back in 1906, they gave a Sunday punch to the Russian Navy.
How did the Japanese restrict you when you were ashore and start pushing you around, you said? What did they do?
They didn't particularly bother us too much on the shore. Sometimes they'd make it more difficult for us to go from here to there. You'd have to go around your elbow to get to your thumb. And then we had rooms at I think it was called the Broadway Mansion. It was down across the Suchow Creek, I believe that. And when we go across there, they'd stop us and inspect the taxi cabs and things we were in. And we were a little arrogant ourselves, so when they'd stick their face in there, we'd put our feet up in the windows or something like that, just for the hell of it.
And what did you see the Japanese doing in their treatment to the Chinese people?
Well, I was in Hankow when the Japanese word came out that the Japanese were ever letting it coming. And I went to bed one evening, and the streets of Hankow were full of people, rickshaws and everything else. I woke up the next morning, and all the streets were clear. Everybody had gone north. And we had 4 rickshaws that we saved down on the pontoon. We gave them our protection. But the Japanese were very ruthless. I remember them coming up the river. Before the Japanese came in and captured Hankow, we moved from a pontoon right up in the city of Hankow, down the river to the standard vacuum compound to give them whatever protection we could.
So the Americans were protecting the Chinese, is that what you're saying?
No. This was a Standard Vacuum Compound was an American company, and we moved down there to anchor or tie up alongside their compound to give them whatever protection. We didn't have much. We did have a couple of 3-inch guns and a couple of old 50 caliber machine guns, and we wouldn't have lasted 15 minutes. They'd have blown us out of the water. But we were down there, and but all the Chinese had evacuated the city, and those that didn't, I remember I looked up the river with a pair of binoculars, and I could see them, excuse me, pushing the Japanese and the Chinese out in the water, and then they shoot them. And I have pictures taken of the burning of Hankow at that time. But we personally were not bothered. And as I say, the Standard Vacuum Compound, this was an oil company owned by Americans. We were downriver, and the Japanese were coming up the river with their boats, and they were taking pictures of us as we went by. So I went in and got my camera and went out and started taking pictures of them. They didn't like that, but there wasn't much they could do about it at the time.
Well, do you recall the reaction of your crew members and fellow officers when they saw the Japanese committing these atrocities?
I didn't.
Do you recall the reaction of your fellow officers and crew members on your ship when these Japanese were pushing the Chinese into the water and shooting them?
Well, I don't remember particularly. We were looking there and just saying, well, what the hell is going on? We were, let's say, quite a distance downriver, but we didn't ever dream that there would be World War II, and I think the Americans were a little bit arrogant at the time. We thought we had a pretty dadgum salty seagoing force, but the Japanese also had a good one, and that was proven during World War II in our encounters with them. And we got a little bit more smart and aware of what they could do. This is particularly in the Japanese torpedoes. They'd run more accurately and faster than our torpedoes. And our torpedoes, and it's well known, right during the early part of World War II, were lousy. And we had to go back and rethink them and revamp them. But the submarine force did come forth, and they devastated the Japanese merchant fleet.
So I think it was 5% of our personnel were in submarines in World War II, and they sunk 50% of the Japanese shipping through the submarines, this limited number of submarines we had. Now, once you left China, trace your career again. Keep on tracing your career forward for us, please.
I left China in May of 1939, and I reported to the USS Ranger in the latter part of June of 1939. The Ranger was the first aircraft carrier that we had built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. It was called CV-4. The first was the Langley, the second was either the Lexington and the Saratoga, or vice versa, and then the Ranger. But the Saratoga and the Lexington were converted from battle cruisers, but the Ranger was built from the keel up as a carrier. It was 769 feet long and would make a top speed of about 29 knots, which was not fast enough as we got on, because the Ranger never played with the big boys in the Pacific. It wasn't fast enough and wasn't good enough.
So after that, keep on going forward. The war is going to start, I assume, and where are you at when the war starts in Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941?
I remember very, very clearly where I was. We were in the Ranger, we were transporting some P-40s. They were painted pink, and we went down the coast of
I relieve the watch.
America,
On deck,
down
section
to
3.
south,
I relieve the
across
watch.
the equator.
On
then
deck,
we went
section
across
3.
to
Relieve the
North
watch.
Africa and delivered these P-40s. Then we were come back and we were coming up the coast, and we were somewhere all close around off the coast of North Carolina. And a young man brought me a dispatch down, and my cabin was down on the third deck. And he handed it to me, and I read it, and it said the Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. I signed to it, and I turned to the young man, I said, those damn fools. And then we came on back up to Norfolk, Virginia, and we had to go ashore in uniform. And all the wives recognized that something was happening when we started going ashore in uniforms.
And then once Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, what does your ship do next? What do you do next?
Well, I stayed on the Ranger until 1943, and we were operating sometimes out in we were in the landing of Northwest Africa on, I think, about the 8th of November 1941, 42 rather. And I stayed with the Ranger until about March of 1943, and Vice Admiral Sharp was commander of Service Force Atlantic Fleet, and he sent someone over for an interview for me to come over. He was looking for a flag secretary. Flag secretary takes care of all the personal mails for the admiral. He had around 400 ships under him. And I went over to talk with Admiral Sharp, a wonderful man and a very nice person to work for. And he talked for a while, and he said, well, would you like to have the job as his flag secretary? I said, yes, Admiral, I'd like to have it, but I'd rather have a destroyer and go to sea. He said, hell, so was I. So would I. You got the job.
So you became his flag secretary?
I became his flag secretary and served for about 2 years as his flag secretary until, middle of 1945, and in August of 45 I reported aboard the USS Fred T. Barrett as commanding officer. It's a brand new destroyer, 392 feet long, had twin rudders and twin screws, lots of speed. I took her out to China and ran up and down the China coast for until March of 47. I came home at that time.
Now, when you're off the coast of China, there was a civil war going on in China, 1945 to 49, Mao Zedong versus Chiang Kai-shek.
45, 47 I was there.
Oh, 47. Did you have any sense, did you get any intelligence concerning that
Well, the war
activity?
with China, the war with Japan was over, of course. It was over about the 15th or 17th of August, 45. And I was just up and down the coast, but we went into Korea, and Korea was nothing like it is today. It was very desolate, and it had been shot up and everything else. And the word was out that the Russians were taking a lot of food from the southern Korea over to Russia, to Vladivostok. So I was assigned a task of trying to find out when they saw a merchant ship. The thing you would do, you'd steam up right on his quarter, and you'd send him the signal AA, and that means what ship. And one night we were steaming around, and my gunnery officer, who was officer of the deck at the time, told me we just passed another ship going in the opposite direction. So I told him to swing around and approach it, and I'd be on up. And I came up on the deck, and
Check
I kept
setting of
sending
material
this ship
condition. Make your reports to Damage Control Central.
They wouldn't answer me. So I turned to my gunnery officer who was the director, and I said, Frank, swing your searchlight around. We had a 36-inch searchlight. When you turn that thing on, it turns night into day better. I said, now shine the searchlight on the fantail, the stern of the ship, and see if you can get the name of it, and then look at the after part of the ship and see if you can find any deck cargo so we can report it. And as soon as I turned that on, as I said, it's just like lighting up. This old boy started answering me. I said, to hell with him, don't pay any attention. So we got what the information we wanted, and I kicked her ahead at 25 knots and gave her a hard right rudder. And as I started passing, why he ran back and got a hold of the searchlight and started throwing it on my ship. And I sat and called up to Frank. I said, Frank, throw that searchlight on his bridge. Well, it just lighted up the bridge, and I don't think I could see for a half hour after that. And I went steaming off and happy as a lark.
Yeah, that destroys their night vision, I guess, real quickly, doesn't it, up on a bridge? Now, after that incident, what happens with the next? Because very soon you're going to be coming aboard the Battleship New Jersey as the executive officer.
Well, I went on down. I spent, I got back in the States in 1947. In 48, I was ordered up to Cornell University as, I went to a chief staff officer for Transdiv 21 for about a year. And then I went up to Cornell University as executive officer of the NROTC. That's the first time I'd lived on the beach. I'd been living on board ship for 14 years, and I was supposed to go ashore for 3 years. And I was up there enjoying my stay on the beach with my family and my daughter and things like that, and having a little bit of family life. And about 1st of October 1950, I got a dispatch that said I was to report to the USS New Jersey as executive officer for recommissioner. And I was detached from Cornell University, give or take a couple of days, 10 October 1950, and I reported as executive officer of the USS New Jersey on the 20th of October.
Now, why do you think you were selected for that position? Because you basically were a destroyer officer. That was where you're like Admiral Halsey. Your heart is in destroyers. Why do you think they brought you up to be the XO of a battleship?
I don't know, but it was a very, very fine job. And matter of fact, there are 4 battleships of the same thing: the Iowa, the Wisconsin, the Missouri, and the New Jersey. And at one time, my classmates, the class of 1934, were all at the same time executive officers of those 4 ships, which was rather unique. I don't know why they selected me. I'd had my own command. I'd operated separately, and I'd been a chief staff officer for a Transdiv. And I guess that maybe my career had built me up to take over as the executive officer of the New Jersey. Now, as executive officer, you carry out the policy for the captain. The captain sets the policy, and you carry out his policy. We had 2,500 men aboard, and when I reported there was maybe 15 or 20, and by the time the captain got there, it was sometime in November, he commented, said, well, we had it pretty well organized, had all the divisions and the department heads going, and he just moved aboard, and of course, took over and set the policy. His name was David Tyree.
Talk to me a little bit, if you could paint a word picture for us. What did you see when you came aboard the Battleship New Jersey? It was, after all, in storage. I think in, was it Bayonne?
What did I see?
Yeah, what was the condition of the ship?
Well, the ship was in Bayonne, New Jersey, and I looked at her and I said, "Boy, she's a big baby," and I just wondered how long it was going to take us to get going, because we had no crew members to speak of, no officers to speak of, and you had to get a small city organized, afloat, get it equipped, and get all the necessary personnel aboard and signed into their different slots. And I think we did it in a pretty reasonable time. We were organized and recommissioned in 20 November 1950. We were shortly thereafter, before Christmas, we were moved over to the Naval Shipyard, Brooklyn Naval Shipyard, and I remember spending Christmas in dry dock there, and there was a big northeastern blowing and water was flowing into some of the dry docks, and I saw one destroyer where enough water had gotten in and floated this destroyer, and she was tilted. And the captain and I talked about this, and we had a big hole in the bottom of the ship cut in. And we just said, well, if this keeps up, how much water are we going to get in our dry dock? So we went out and sandbagged the side where you had a little raise about this high on boards and stuff around. And where there was a break in that, we sandbagged it. And I kept very close tab on the pontoon that closed the dry dock. And I personally was out there supervising all this. And the water got up within a couple of inches of going over the caisson that was across the dry dock, and the weather abated. Now, I don't think we'd ever gotten enough water in the dry dock to float it, because it was a big dry dock. But you had to prepare for those things, and it was Christmas, and no one was around in the Naval Shipyard. You couldn't find anybody if you wanted the pumps to go, we didn't have anybody to man the pumps, because I talked to the captain about this. I said, suppose we needed help to pump this dry dock out. Where are we going to get it? But fortunately, the weather abated, and we came out flying with flying colors.
Now, soon after that, the ship will be recommissioned again. It's floated back, it goes back to Bayonne, is that correct, for the commissioning ceremony?
No, we were commissioned. The recommissioning ceremony was held on the 20th of November, as I remember, 1950. And then after we were recommissioned, we moved over to the dry dock in Brooklyn Naval Shipyard.
Now, at the recommissioning, you had several speakers, correct?
Well, at the recommissioning, we had several.
Admiral Halsey was there.
Well, I can tell you there was Admiral Halsey was one of our speakers. Governor Driscoll, the governor of New Jersey, was one of them. Vice Admiral Badger was there, but he didn't speak. He was primarily to take care of Admiral Halsey. Admiral Halsey was getting up in years. He graduated, I think, in the class of 1904, and this was 1950, so he's 46 years out. And Captain Tyree was one of the speakers.
Now, what was the reaction of people at this point to Admiral Halsey? He had, some people say, a great World War II career. Some say it was somewhat mixed. Do you recall what people thought about Halsey at this point?
Well, people thought that they had very, very high opinion of him. And people liked Admiral Halsey. He was a good personal relation man. He was one of the statements I heard, I didn't ever recall it, but somebody said when they were flying up over Japan, and one of the aviators called back to the ship and peace had been signed, And they had the admiral said, "What do we do if we encounter some Japanese planes up there?" And Admiral Halsey sent back and said, "Shoot them down in a friendly manner." And that's the way he had the personnel and the capable of appealing to the men and the public, and he was very good at it.
Now, one person who didn't attend the ceremony that day was the commander in charge of the New York Naval Base, Captain or Admiral then, Carl Holden, the first commander of the Battleship New Jersey. I read he didn't attend because he didn't want to overshadow the recommissioning. What do you recall about Captain Holden, if you had a chance to meet him?
I never met him. I never knew of Captain Holden. I knew a couple of the officers of Commander Rufus Rose, who finally became exec of the New Jersey. I was with him when he was a lieutenant and I was an ensign. And Rufus Rose was an ordnance expert.
Now, once the ship goes to sea, I read that you had some trouble with your electrical systems.
Well,
what happened there?
One of the things that had impressed me when we were recommissioning the ship, we had a lot of small fires. And it seemed to me as if always the fire party was out busy. And these were because you had electric shorts around through the ship. I don't know how many miles of electric cable you got aboard this ship, but I bet it would astound you if you ever found the exact thing. And so it seemed to me that we were putting out these small fires. That was the main thing. But when you think about recommissioning a ship, you got to get all the stores aboard, all the spare parts for your engines, for your turbines, for your guns, for your food for the crew, and all the galley equipment and everything. It's truly a time-consuming and very large job. You don't just say, let's recommission it. You got to get all that stuff aboard. And you've got the ship 888 feet long, draws 35 feet of water, makes 35 knots. Your supply officer and your department heads of the various departments have to be on the ball, and they're the ones that did the work. All I did is get them together and say, how are we making out, and how you doing, and when do you think you'll have your department ready, and things like that.
When they're recommissioning a ship the size of the Battleship New Jersey, it seems to me that they would select high-quality officers and men to get the ship operating again. Did you find that was true, that the people you worked with in supply and so on like that were good quality officers and men?
Yes, they were. They were very good. We had the supply officer was a fellow named Commander Strock. He was very good. The gunnery officer was Commander Smedling. He was what you call a smoothbore gunnery officer. He'd never been to graduate school for gunnery, but he'd spent a lot of time in gunnery. And you had an engineering officer named Commander Fry, who knew what he was doing. Had a chaplain, two chaplains. We had 3 or 4 medical officers. Commander Amy was a very fine surgeon. And so we had high quality officers aboard ship. And they are the ones that are responsible. You can't really screen the people down to the ensigns and JGs and lieutenants, but you get the good top people, and they'll take care of the rest.
Now, talking about top people, talk to me a little bit about Captain Tyree. What was he like as a person, his effectiveness as a leader aboard the ship, and getting the ship recommissioned again, and then ultimately sailing a ship through the Panama Canal and over to and operating off the coast of Korea?
Well, Commander Tyree was a gunnery officer. He came aboard ship sometime around the 1st of November, as I recall. I don't recall exactly. He was a very nice man to work for. He was fairly rigid in his operations, and he never really but never really developed his personality with the crew. But his successor, Captain McCarkle, was an entirely different man. McCarkle, his nickname was Tiny. He was about 6'4", but McCarkle would walk down through the compartment, taking a yeoman with him and his orderly, and he'd, let's say, go into the butcher shop or go into the machine shop, and he'd ask the guy, say, well, what's your name, and where are you from, what's your hometown, and everything else. And this yeoman would write all that down. When he got back up to his quarters, he would pick up the microphone and address the crew and said, I just looked through the quarters today, and the ship looks fine. And by the way, we stopped in the butcher shop and I saw Pete Smith, who was from Kenosha, Wisconsin, and he's doing a very fine job in the machine shop. And the men like that. And everybody likes personal attention, and he was able to do it. And he was more of a politician than and a personnel man than David Tyree. As commanding officers, they were both about the same.
So you said they're both the same as their effectiveness as commanding officers. Did you notice a change, even though you served with Captain McCorkle for a relatively short period of time, did you notice a change in morale among the men when Captain Tyree left and Captain McCorkle came aboard?
Well, I might, as I think back about it, I didn't notice any perceptible change, except when the captain was around, the men, you could see, really liked him. But as a welfare and the personnel of the ship, there was never much change. When we were off in Korea, why, I worked very, very hard to find some way to establish, see, when you're out on the firing line and you're standing watches 1 and 3, people get tired. And so I finally came up with a plan of the day, and if we had reveille at 6 o'clock in the morning, I said you didn't have to get up at 6, but if you didn't get to the mess hall on time, you'd have to do without breakfast. And when we came noon, 11:30 to 1, I said you could have down bunks, but it was up to you to get to the mess hall and get your food. I wasn't going to make any allowances for it. And that gave the men more rest and more time. And when the Wisconsin came in and relieved us, I handed my plan of the day to the executive officer of the Wisconsin, who was a good friend of mine. And he looked at it and said, Coley, you can't do that. I said, well, that's what we did, and this is what I came up with, a working program. You can come up with whatever you want. That's your job.
What would your day be like as the executive officer aboard the Battleship New Jersey off the coast of Korea?
What was a day like?
What was an average day like?
It was a long day. It was a long day. We had 3 or 4 people that could stand the command duties, and we were firing maybe day and night, and you'd get just bone tired, because you thought you had to be up on the bridge. And I remember one time I was up there, and the captain was I could look at him, he was worn out. And he'd given an order to turn the ship in such and such a direction. And I said, Captain, you can't do that. If you do, you'll run across the bow of the fast carrier group. He said, well, turn it. He didn't pay any attention to me. And I told him about 2 or 3 times. And I was walking aft, I'd kind of given up. And I passed Commander Smedley, and he said, Coley, you know what's going to happen? I said, yep. I said, I've told him 3 times. He said, well, go back and tell him once more, why don't you? So I did. And he changed the orders. And we didn't cross the bow of the carrier, which would have embarrassed the carrier, and then jumped down the throat of the skipper. But he was dog tired. And fortunately, I wasn't. I'd gotten some rest. And that's what happens to you. You've got to get sleep. And if you don't take care of your crew and don't give them some sleep and don't give them some rest and food, you're going to get poor results.
Now, we're conducting this interview in the XO's cabin that you used to occupy. What do you see that's the same and that's different from when you were aboard the ship in the early 1950s?
This cabin now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, where I sit right now was where my desk was. And where this divan was over where the desk is, over against that bulkhead. And the bedroom in there, it didn't have the shelves and things against the wall there. I had a cabinet, a clothes cabinet, and a metal cabinet to hang my clothes in there, and then the shower. And I had different colored carpeting, of course, and it was painted a little bit differently. I think it's painted pea green, but
You cabin 1 contact the forward quarterdeck 7203. You
I
cabin
changed
1
that
contact
color.
quarterdeck
Everything else
7203.
was pea green, and I changed it to kind of a light tan, just because I thought I'd like to have a different color.
What was your relationship with Captain Tyree? What was he like as a commander to work for? Did he listen to you very much? Did he share ideas with you? Did he just command you? Did he see you as a co-equal helping out running the ship?
Well, yes, he'd let us handle the ship. He'd let us bring the ship into anchor. And matter of fact, I've forgotten whether it was the Tyree, but I think it was. It could have been McCarkle. But when we used to go in to tie up to a buoy, the flare of the bow, when you were standing on the conning bridge level, you'd lose sight of the buoy. And I suggested to the skipper, I said, why don't you just put me down on the forecastle right up in the eyes of the ship? And when you lose sight up there, just turn the con over to me and I'll take it on up. We were almost there. And we did that, and it worked out very well. And you've got to remember that the U-shackle, when you put it over the eye in the buoy, I don't know what the U-shackle worked, but the pin went through that, weighed 80 pounds. So you had a crew down there, and you had to hold that ship right there, and you didn't want the chain to drop down.
I think you did that at Yokosuka, Japan, I've read.
What's that?
In Yokosuka, Japan, I think that's where you handled that, tying up to a large buoy.
Yeah.
I think that was in Yokosuka, probably, you handled that. I remember reading that. That was
Yeah.
a story in Paul Stilwell's book on the Battleship New Jersey.
Now, I don't know whether any other ship did that or not, but we weren't doing it when we first came in. And this was my suggestion, and this is what we did.
One other question I have is, what is the reaction of the crew? Obviously, you're in a combat situation. How did the crew react to the war itself, to the Korean War? Were they dedicated to the work? Did they just put up with their work?
Well, I thought we had a very fine crew, and I thought the crew worked very hard. And I established what I called a suggestion box, and I let the crew put in the suggestions they had in this box. And then I would get the chief past master at arms and maybe another chief and department heads, and we'd look at these suggestions, and if we thought one was a crank one that didn't mount to anything, we'd throw it away, but then we'd come up with the answer and try to answer the suggestion of the crew. And if you'd have told me I would do that when I was an ensign in the United States Navy, I don't think I would have said yes. But after running this ship for a little while, I said, I think maybe we ought to do something like that. I don't think I've ever been on another ship that had it. That didn't mean other ships hadn't done it. But that's what we came up with.
How did the crew react to the really constant firing? When you're on a gun line off of Korea, you're working 24 hours a day, basically. Were they tired out after a month or two of doing that before they would go back to Japan or for a break?
Yes, they were tired, but that's the reason I changed the plan of the day to let them get more sleep. They could sleep from 4 o'clock on if they wanted to. That was never permitted on a ship in peacetime. And they could sleep during the noon time, and they could sleep later in the morning. So this all played a part in the crew being rested and being able to perform their job better. As I said earlier, you got a tired man, and he's not going to react correctly.
Now, one of the crewmen was killed by shore fire. Name was Osterwise, I believe. Do you recall that event, and could you describe to us what happened, because we get several different reports as to what happened to that young crewman?
Yes, his name was Osterwind, Osterwind, and we were up in Wonsan, and Wonsan had some guns over on the beach, and they opened fire on us, and they hit the number 2 target, and so I turned to the captain and said he wanted like have general quarters, and that's man your battle stations. And so we sounded general quarters, and this young man was doing everything correct. He was approaching his battleship on the disengaged side, and some shell went over the ship and exploded, and the shrapnel hit him and killed him right back around turret 3 on the starboard quarter. And I remember going back there. They'd already moved him to the sick bay by the time I got back there, but I remember the blood and everything else being around. We had 2,500 men aboard, and that's the only person we lost. If you'd had 2,500 men in town in the United States, there'd been a few of them killed by automobile accidents and things like that. I thought we had a very good safety record.
What was the reaction of the crew to the death of this young sailor?
Well, it was amazing. Not really amazing, but it was very nice. They, on their own, wanted to take up a collection, and they wanted to donate this collection to some good cause. And I don't know who came up with it, but it was a member of the crew, I think. It came up with the idea to donate it to dialysis machines. I think it was a dialysis machine. I'm not quite positive on that. Because the school I was in, we did something similar, and I get the two kind of confused at the time. But anyway, they took up this collection and purchased this thing, and then, as I say, Captain McCarkle came aboard, and he was more public relation minded, and he took the idea and really developed it. And we had the representative from New Jersey down, we had the Osterwinds come in, and this was, my daughter just handled me this. We had a regular program for it, and addressed by Captain McCarkle and presentation by a representative from the state of New Jersey. And we had the Mr. and Mrs. Osterwind down also. So I think it was quite appropriate, and it wasn't my idea. It was a member of the crew, and if you ask me what member of the crew, I couldn't tell you.
Now, is there anything I haven't asked about the Battleship New Jersey's experiences off the coast of North Korea that I should have asked, that you think is important to leave for the historical record?
Now, I didn't quite.
Is there anything that you'd like to say more about the Battleship New Jersey's action off of Korea that I haven't asked about?
Well, you've pretty well covered the waterfront, except that the long hours, and we did cover it very shortly, but you would be firing one or two guns, primarily one gun, and inland maybe 40,000 yards. That's about the range of a 16-inch. And the 16-inch gun is an amazing piece of equipment. Not only can it fire 40,000 yards, that's 20 nautical miles, they can do it accurately. And how do I know they did it accurately? We used to receive letters from the troops on the beach talking about the devastation of the 16-inch shell. You have armor piercing, you have anti-personnel shells and things like that. Of course, we use anti-personnel shells. And it takes, that projectile weighed around 2,700 pounds. It was 5 feet 6 inches tall, thereabouts. It took 565 pounds of powder to fire one shell. And that's in 5 bags, and the bags weighed 113 pounds apiece, and they were encased in raw silk, and on the back of each powder bag was a red patch, and that was filled with black powder. And black powder is very unstable. And so, and the powder grains inside were about as big around as my thumb, maybe a little bit bigger, and about an inch or so long. And they had 5 holes drilled in them. And the purpose of this was slow down the detonation. It sounded like an explosion, but it was so designed that the powder would burn progressively, and that would build up the pressure to push the shell out of the muzzle. And when the shells would take off, you could see them, and they sounded like a big old freight train going through the air. Those guns could be brought back to level, reloaded, and ready to fire in 55 to 60 seconds. Now, you had to be careful. You had a flexible rammer, and the man that was handling this rammer had to ram that projectile home. He had to ram it home with enough force to seat it in there with the brass or a copper burley around it. Then, when he put in the powder bags, he had to send them in, push them in gently, so he didn't break the powder bags, because if you broke them, you got that black powder scattered around and you could have trouble.
Now, I also read that several of your rounds were short rounds. They would fire and fall into the ocean or just explode, that you had some old ammunition. Was that a common problem, that you're shooting old ammunition left over?
It happened quite often. This old ammunition was stored up in Japan, I believe. And I didn't really recognize the fact that it was old ammunition. I don't think there was a lot I could have done about it. But I remember one night being up on the bridge late at night, and the Lieutenant Commander Abernathy and I were standing there in the chart house, and we fired, and somehow or another the the sound of the gun seemed different to me. And I turned to Abernathy and I said, "Did you notice a difference in that sound out there?" He said, "No." Pretty soon the officer deck called in and said, "Well, we had a big premature," and said it scattered shrapnel all over the deck. Of course, you had decks cleared and all the compartments battened down. But yes, we had quite a few prematures.
Did any short rounds ever land on friendly troops that you knew
No,
of?
not that I know.
You're lucky not to have that
No,
situation.
these were primarily muzzle exploding, the shell exploding, not the powder coming out of the gun or anything like that, but the anti-personnel explosive inside the thing. We'd fire wham, wham. And that was when you heard the second one, where you had a premature. Yeah.
Now, Captain McCorkle, the ship is going to go back to the United States to be refitted, and Captain McCorkle will take over.
He took over in Japan.
In Japan, he took over.
Sasebo.
Sasebo, and the ship was going to be refitted there, or was it going back to the States for refitting?
Well, I don't think, Captain, I think we headed right back to the States after he took over. I don't remember him being on board doing any interdiction fire.
When the ship goes back for repair, what are some of the problems that had to be fixed? What things break, what things wear out, what things don't work anymore after operating?
Well, after such and such a length of time, why, your machinery is beginning to wear. Your diesel engines are beginning to cause problems. Your guns need to be checked out, and you had a lot of work requests. I've taken a destroyer of my own through shipyard repair, and you preparing way ahead of time. On the way back home, we started for New Jersey, getting our work requests and things out that we need when we get back. And then when you go into the naval shipyard, you usually have a meeting about once a week with all the department heads and the naval shipyard personnel. And you say, well, job such and such, what's the percentage, and is it going to be completed on time? The next one, what's the percentage, and is it going to be completed on time? There's always a little problem when you come out of the shipyard. Not big, but little problem. Sometimes you have the naval shipyard people working on it, and you get down to you're ready to go to sea, or they stay aboard and have a tug pick them up. But it's a huge job to get all the things, and you have to keep tab on your machinery, and you have to have competent people that are willing to step up. Battleship New Jersey.
Start again.
Well, I left the Battleship New Jersey in about February the 2nd, 1952. And I was ordered to the Armed Forces Staff College. It was a 6-month course, and I served there. I went there, graduated from the Armed Forces Staff College, and one of our speakers at graduation was Bernard Baruch, who was quite a well-known individual. Then I reported to Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet Staff for 2 years. And out of that, I went to, this is 51, I went to '54. I left the Commander-in-Chief's staff and went to Washington, D.C. as Naval Intelligence, Department of Naval Intelligence. I served there 2 years, was ordered up to the Naval War College, and served a year up there. And on leaving the Naval War College, I took over a fleet tanker in 57 and 58. And we operated in the Atlantic Fleet, North Atlantic, for 1 year. And I remember pulling into the Delaware River going up to Philadelphia, and I turned to the exec and said, I'm sure glad to be off the North Atlantic for a while, particularly in the winter time. And after that, I reported to the Washington, D.C., the Commander-in-Chief, Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I served there for 2 years, and then I retired. On retirement, I had worked and gotten practically a master's degree in education. I returned to Oklahoma City in 1961. I stayed in Norfolk, in Washington, D.C. to let my daughter complete her high school. I'd had her in 10 schools in 10 years, and I thought she rated staying with and graduating. So we stayed there a year. Then we came out to Oklahoma City, and I started teaching from Putnam City high school math, and then I taught in the junior high, and then I became principal of a couple of schools. And I became very active in the civil life in Oklahoma City, and we established the first district of historical significance in the state of Oklahoma. I led that fight. And now there are 9 districts of historical significance in Oklahoma City, and when we first started there were only 50 homeowners organizations. Now there are 280 homeowners organizations. So this historic, and we were people, well, let me just backtrack just a little. People were moving out of the area. I bought a house that's 100 years old. It wasn't 100 years old when I bought it, but it was built in 1903. And people were moving out of the area like rats leaving a sinking ship. And we tried homeowners organizations, and we couldn't stop it. Couldn't stop the encroachment of business. And I came up with the idea, I don't like to say I, but I was the only one that did come up, and said, why don't we try the historic movement? And I delivered papers on the street in which I lived as a boy, and I always admired these homes. And I knew the homes had been built by many civic leaders. And so we did. We went the historic route, and the city bought it. And our area is very, very, very successful as a homeowners organization. As I say, we're the first one in the state, and we have large trees, beautiful homes, and I remember we have everything from 5-room bungalow up to a 20,000 square foot building, home. And I remember I used to call the people and encourage them to join in with our fight to preserve this area. And they said, well, there's nothing historic about my home. I said, well, it won't be if they tear it down either. So I started that about 1962, 63. In 1967, the mayor appointed me as on a Historical Preservation Landmark Commission. And we wrote the ordinance for the Historical Preservation Ordinance. Not I, but we people on it. And it was approved by the city council in February 1969. And our area is named Heritage Hills. And it was placed under the protection of this historical preservation ordinance. And the result was astounding. Almost immediately, we stopped encroachment of business. Young people seeing that their investments were being protected, they start buying homes in there and start refurbishing them. And today we're going to Jesse, and we have meetings every 11 months out of the year. We have a board of 50 members, and as I say, Heritage Hills is the top. I don't say that just because I live there, but we're the oldest one in the state, and it's been a very, very successful thing. And many people don't realize what historic preservation's done for the city, but it has been really a success, and it's been a thing of joy for me.
That's been an outstanding piece of work you did. That's based on your Navy experience and administration and leadership experience. Well, I do have one final question I forgot to ask you about, and I said I would ask this during the interview. One thing I'm looking at is race relations in the Navy, and you were aboard the Battleship New Jersey, and Harry Truman integrated the military in the late 1940s. What was the situation between racial groups on the ship?
Well, I had encountered this problem a little bit earlier when I'd had a destroyer, and this was right at the tail end of World War II, matter of fact from 45 to 47. And it was touch and go, and I never had any problems in dealing with people, one job, one color or another. And I did give the blacks on there, because they're on this destroyer, there was some friction, and so I called the head one in and I said, look, here is the best living compartment on the ship.
Now, Liberty call. Liberty for sections 1 and 3. Liberty to expire on board 0800 tomorrow. Now, Liberty call.
Move everybody out and scatter it throughout the ship. They didn't keep it clean, so I moved them, and I never had any trouble. When I came to the New Jersey, I had they assigned a mess attendant to take care of my room and things like that, and he didn't like it, and he was, I think he'd been an agitator, but he didn't bother me particularly. I called him in and sat him down, and I told him, I said, well, my shoes weren't shined. He said, well, I'm not a shoe shine boy. I said, neither am I, but I can shine them better than that. And then I called them all together and talked to them. And I'd used the expression all my life, you people. And unfortunately, I used it when addressing them. And they thought I was lowering and against them. And I had to talk to 2 or 3 of them. But we didn't have any problems, and I think it's because I tried to play straightforward with them. I didn't talk about them behind the back, and I gave them as good a relationship as I could. As a matter of fact, I thought that one of their ratings they had aboard ship was very good. It was a mess attendant's ratings, and they had better working hours, and they had better working positions than the crew as a whole. I mean, they weren't down in the hold, scrubbing the hold or something like that. And I pointed that out to them. And when I went to Admiral Sharp's staff, Commander Service Force Atlantic Fleet, I talked to him about that and said we ought to put out a publication embellishing the rating of mess attendant and open it up to everybody. And he said, well, why don't you write a letter on that? Well, I never got around to it, but as I look back, I should have. But I think things have worked out very well. And I never had any personal problems other than what I've just told you.
Well, thank you, sir. As I promised, we talked for only 10 minutes. We just had 11 minutes and 50 seconds, so we're going to let you go. Today I've been talking with Captain Charles Coley, who served aboard the Battleship New Jersey from October 20th, 1950 to February 24, 1952, where he served as executive officer. My name is Dr. Tom Batt, and I'm from Kean University in the Battleship New Jersey Oral History Project. Captain Coley, I want to thank you so much for a real fine interview, and I want to thank you for your service to the country and also for your work in Oklahoma City, too. You really helped the city, help turn itself around and preserve the city so it doesn't fall apart. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
I thank you. It's been my pleasure being here.
Thank you.
Tile that's in the wardroom, when you were on here, was that tile or steel decks?
The tile that was in the wardroom, it seemed to me like it was
I'm sorry.
sort of a green linoleum.
Was it green linoleum?
Yeah, I think it was.
And they put that on in 1950?
Well, I don't know, Mom, but we had a painting on the bulkhead right there where we used to sit.
Mm-hmm.
It was a steel painting, a painting on steel, stainless steel. It was of, let's say, of a naval officer back in the late 1780s or something like that. And it was a very nice painting, and I hope that wherever it is being preserved.
It's not on here, I know that.
And
Part of that painting should be set off
for the USS New Jersey. We had to scourge around to find it.
I know, it got lost in warehouses. It ended up in Philadelphia.
The punch bowl is in the governor's mansion.
Yes.
I know that because the First Lady of Oklahoma wrote a book of mansions of the governors of the state of the United States. And I saw the picture in there that I don't know where the rest of the Silver Service is.
It's called Drumthwacket, which is the governor's up in New Jersey.
Princeton.
Is it under glass or something like that?
They keep it in storage most of the time, and they bring it down a couple times a year to polish it, and they bring it out for special occasions. But legally, I found out looking through way back in the paperwork, the state of New Jersey does not. Legally.
Well, yes, it was given to the ship.
It was given to
The first USS
the Battleship
New
New Jersey from the residents of the state of New Jersey.
Yes, and it was given to them in 1906.
Yes.
It was purchased from Tiffany,
Yes.
and it purchased at a price of $10,000.
Yes.
And in November 50, we wrote a letter to Tiffany, and they came back and said they valued the Silver Service at $50,000 to $60,000 then, but they wouldn't replace it for that much because they couldn't find the silversmith to do it. Now, just off the record.
Camera's still on. This is on the record.
Really?
The state of Oklahoma had a big argument between preservations and the governor's mansion on whether we would preserve the punch bowl. And then again, this lady that wrote this book on the governor's mansion, Mrs. Keating, had raised funds to handmade, a replica of the punch bowl, only in silver plate. And we have that punch bowl of Oklahoma under glass where it's not having to be polished. If you keep on polishing those things, pretty soon you won't have anything. I got that idea from the Norfolk, Virginia. They had a mace down in Norfolk, Virginia that they used to break out for the parades every year. And they finally got smart and they put that mace away and had a replica made of harder metal. And the original is being preserved. And that's, I just think that maybe might be a good idea for the state of New Jersey to put that punch bowl on your glass.
I don't have a whole lot of influence